This time of year as a triathlete, starting to have those aches and pains with the Achilles is pretty common for many of us. The miles have increased on the bike, the miles have increased out on the running, and we get some of those early signs. Maybe it's a little bit of swelling, maybe it's a little bit of discomfort that increases over the miles, that things are just starting to niggle through there a little bit. The positive thing though is there are a couple of key critical things that you can do that, even though are very simple, are often very poorly done by most triathletes, regardless of their ability, age or experience. So what we're going to share now is those two simple things that you can do, and linking in the science as to why your Achilles will react as a triathlete to the training that you're doing, how we can prevent it. Now, as those miles increase, particularly with running, but also remember your calves will work quite hard in relative terms when you cycle, the demand on the Achilles becomes greater and greater. And it's not one isolated foot contact or push on a pedal or maybe calf raise that's going to cause an Achilles problem. It's the accumulation of thousands and thousands of foot contacts going through the floor. Now, if you don't have sufficient recovery between, say, for example, your running sessions, and you don't allow your Achilles to be able to regenerate, what starts to happen then is that's when we start to get into this negative cycle where we get a reactive Achilles tendon. And that's the early stages of when we start to run into some of these problems, maybe a little bit of swelling, the pain and the discomfort. And this is the stage, ideally, that we don't get into. But if we can act quickly enough, we can avoid it becoming a much bigger issue. So that creates the link as to why if we can develop more strength through those muscles, we can reduce the amount of loading that goes onto your Achilles, but also indirectly as well, certain types of gait, particularly toe contacts. So if you're very toe contact, so if we say like forefoot striking, when you run, again, you're more likely to get a lot more pressure go through your Achilles tendon. And that's usually linked again to having weakness in and around the hips. So it's not just about the calf muscles, yes, fundamentally, but indirectly, it's also about those hip muscles as well. Now, what can you do then with strength work to make sure you're going to get the benefits that it can deliver to reduce the amount of strain on your Achilles? The first one is actually putting into frame a common myth, and the belief is that strength work is the most demanding thing on your Achilles. There's recent science that shows over dozens, about a dozen of calf exercises using strength training, the load on your Achilles tendon is immensely less than it is when you just go for a jog. So your strength work should always, first of all, ideally occur before you have a problem with your Achilles. But if you are starting to get that reactiveness through your Achilles, you should start your strength work before you go running, because it's less demanding on the Achilles than when you actually go running. And what we're trying to do is obviously reduce the load on that Achilles. So if we're only starting running before we've actually done any strength work, we haven't actually increased the capacity of that Achilles tendon to be able to cope with what's about to go through it. When people do calf exercises for strength, people think you have to go right up onto your toes like a ballerina. It's what we call lots of plantar flexion. But if you think when you're running, you go nowhere near through that amount of plantar flexion. You don't go right onto your toes when you're running, and if you do, you probably will get an Achilles problem. So you don't need to go through those big right onto your toe ranges, because consequently what you do then, you won't load the exercise enough and you won't get the same benefits. The other thing though is at the other end of the movement, what will commonly happen is people go into way too much dorsiflexion. That's when your toes go up towards your shin. And with most of us being triathletes being relatively tight through our calf muscles, commonly what will happen is you'll go way too deep. It puts loads of pressure on that Achilles that you don't want to do. And consequently, you can compensate to create that extra range of motion for your ankle that you haven't got by maybe rolling your ankle or even bending your knee, classic common things. So again, you don't need to go through excessive depths, because if you think about when you run, how much actually of that dorsiflexion, your toes coming towards your shin, how much do you really get when you're running? Often not as much as what people think when they're training the exercises. So aside from managing your running volumes and distances, which is imperative, strength training is just the absolute number one thing as a training tool, not foam rolling, not putting on K-tape, the number one tool to keep any Achilles problems at bay and to make sure you minimise your risk of having them in the first place.